So today in the shop we have a 1985 911 Carrera that we are going to be doing a clutch, a valve adjustment, and some oil return tubes that are leaking. So we're underneath that car, and the first thing I'm going to do is get our oil draining. This car is just driven in, so it's hot. I want to get as much of the oil out of it as I possibly can. So I have my engine drain right here. The 3.2s do not run a sump plate if you're not super familiar with them. And then we have our oil tank over here. So I'm going to get my oil drains, get that moving. Hot fingers. Very hot fingers. I'll let this side sit and drip a little bit longer. Get as much of that oil out of there as I can. All right, so I've got the oil drained out and I've let the car cool down for about an hour, hour and a half. So the first thing I want to do before I pull the engine is disconnect the battery. So I'm going to come up front and disconnect my ground strap. So for me, the next spot I want to go to is going to be my gear shift and get rid of that. So I'm going to access the gear shift and the speedometer plugs, because this has an electronic speedometer, through this little access panel in the rear floor. When you're in here, we don't want to touch this bolt right here. We want to just peel this boot back, and we're going to undo this 4mm set screw. And then over here, this little tiny one right here, that's going to be my speedometer. So I'm going to cut that zip tie and disconnect these so they can feed out through the body there. Okay, so this is my speedometer that I want to disconnect. And I don't really care which wire goes where. And then I'm going to take this plastic plug and stuff it through the hole down there. Okay, I can feel that on the other side. Okay, as my gear shift disconnected, I'm going to leave this rubber boot right here, and we're done inside the car. So first thing I do is put my fender cover on. There's two clips at the back side here for that airbox. We want to bring it out. Let's take a quick look at the filter. Looks pretty nice. Okay, normally there would be an air conditioning compressor here, but on this car it's already been removed. So we're going to jump straight over here. Okay, get my electrical panel cover off, and then I'm going to disconnect my main engine harness right here. I'm just going to lay that down inside the engine compartment. So I'm just going to loosen the clamp here just so I can get this pipe out. I've got one more bolt on the back to take out. Just pops that plastic pipe out. This is for my heater vent. Over here is our main ground connection. So any of you that have done anything on engine work for rough idling conditions or rough running, this connection is one of the biggest weak points on these cars. So every time you have these apart, we want to clean them before they go back on. So you can see there's some corrosion starting to build up there. We'll dress all of those off and make sure they're as clean as they could possibly be before we bolt it back together. And this harness is just going to lay up under here. So back here, these are our TDC sensors, our speed sensor, and this is our NTC2 temperature sensor. These plugs are interchangeable, so what I normally do is I just put a single Sharpie mark on one, just so when it comes back together it makes it a little bit faster. And then we can just go and unplug these. And then that harness will tuck over here again as well. While I'm here, this is my O2 sensor. Looks like the plug is already broken. And this is for my O2 sensor heater connection. All right, so my O2 sensor is disconnected. This plug has seen better days. Then back here, this is going to be my vacuum line to my brake booster. Disconnect that, and also we have vacuum line running up to our cruise control unit. I disconnected it at the cruise control actuator just because I don't want to break this plastic piece off right here. And I'm going to get these two fuel lines disconnected and get them out of my way before I disconnect those. So I'm popping off the cover off my ignition coil and disconnecting my coil wire, hooking it over on the engine. So my cruise control cable is bolted to the throttle housing. There's two Phillips head screws that I want to undo, and they're kind of a pain in the butt. So I'm just going to crack them loose first. So there's my cruise control. I just want to lay this out of my way. So I've got my vent lines that need to come off. To get the oil filter out of the way. Just an oil filter wrench. I got two 17mm wrenches, and we're going to probably lose some fuel out of there once I unscrew it. Just going to bring it up and out of my way. Then the next one I want to take is going to be on the top of my fuel filter. Whoever was working on this car last time really over-tightened everything. Okay, so there's my fuel lines out. My fuel line out, I can go after my brake booster line a little better. All right, so just to kind of sum it up, we've got all of our electrical disconnected, laying into our engine compartment. We've got our ground and our sensor wires disconnected, laying up against the frame rail. Fuel lines are disconnected. Here's our return line right here. Hook that over the top of the fuel filter just to keep it out of my way. My pressure line is just stuffed up into the fan. Over this side, we've got all of our breathers disconnected. And there's one last plug which is located right back here, and you can't really see it. I'll show it to you when the engine's out. You've just kind of got to reach back here and feel for it. I'll show you what it looks like. This is the plug right here, but it's mounted on that back frame rail, and you can't see it. You just got to reach back in there and feel for it and disconnect it. That's a common one when guys are pulling the engines out on these to miss because you can't see it, and then you get halfway out. If you're not paying attention, you can destroy that harness. So if you want to take a quick look here at the torsion bar, it's not a job that we're doing right now, but this is something that you need to pay attention with every time you have the wheels off. See how the bottom of that torsion bar housing, the clearance down here, is much bigger than the clearance up here. And this is pretty normal as this bushing wears. And what happens is eventually, I mean, I've seen these so bad before that they've actually worn this pivot, this bar cap end through the outside of this cover. But this car is going to need a set of bushings back here pretty soon. Okay, so I'm just going to do my axles. Can you see all the way in there? Okay, one of the really good things about later model cars is they have the CV joint is encapsulated. So no more walking past these things and getting a hair full of molly grease. All right, so with my drive shafts off, what I have left is going to be my throttle link right here, my heater control cables, my heater pipes right here. Both sides are going to come off. Clutch cable is going to come off. Rear sway bar is going to come off. Over here we also have our ground connection that's going to come off. So we're going to disconnect all of these items, get everything done, and then we're ready to drop this out onto the ground. Okay, there's my clutch cable disconnected. I'm going to disconnect, this is my actual clutch activating lever. I just pulled that little return spring off, and then we want to work it down off of those splines like that. Bring it down, and then I'm going to get my pry bar and release that spring. They're under a lot of spring pressure, so you got to be careful with them. Just pop it forward, and then this whole piece should slide off just like that. These are also prone to cracking, so you want to have a good look at them while they're off. And we'll wash it up a little bit later. There's also a roller bearing in there. You want to make sure these are moving nice and smooth. And these little seal rings right here are nice and soft. These usually get rock hard. Pulling the ground strap out. If you come around on this side, you can see where I stuffed that speedometer line. It comes straight out of this hole right here. This one's pretty rusty and feels like maybe that bushing is short there. Okay, so we're going to disconnect our throttle linkage. That ball socket is pretty rusty, so I'm just squirting a little bit of lubricant. Pop that off right here. This link, we just have to be careful as we let it down. I'll move the drive shaft around to make it miss. You can, if you want, disconnect it now. It makes it a little bit easier, but I usually don't. So I've got my battery disconnected. I'm going to disconnect my starter motor main line right now. So this is usually a 13mm nut up here. And just pull that down, stick it over to the side. This is why it's very important to have that battery disconnected. This is a main line, and if you short out to something on the body, it's going to be a major deal. Okay, I'm going to pull my sway bar next. So normally, I don't want to take this completely off just yet. When I loosen this last one up, the bar's going to drop. Oh no. Just like that. Now I can take my nut off, pop it out, get the bar out of the way. All right, so that's pretty much everything that's holding that engine in, except for my oil line. So I have oil return connection here, suction line connection here. Both of these lines need to be disconnected. They're both gonna leak oil. So I'm gonna go and get my oil pan, loosen this stuff up, try and control it as best as I can when I undo these. So far, so good.
So how is this without a lift?
Doable. Completely doable, but you're working on your back for the last part because you're obviously laying underneath the car instead of standing under it. But I've done hundreds on the ground. Even when I worked for Porsche, we didn't always have a rack available, so I'd do them on the ground there. So I have some plugs left over from when I bought new hoses that I can plug some of this stuff off. Okay, so that's going to minimize the amount of oil dripping while I'm pulling the engine and moving things around. So that pretty much wraps up everything underneath. We got 2 bolts at the back, 2 bolts up here, so 2 bolts at the transmission, 2 bolts up at the engine. We need to get our floor jack under with our engine tool that's going to lock in right here to support the engine, and we're ready to bring it down and drop it on the ground. Tell me when it gets close. Close. So I've got my jack supporting the engine. I'm going to pull my rear engine mounts first. And then I'm going to slide under and do my transmission mounts. So now my engine is basically ready to come out. So one thing you want to do, you can see this is that plug that I was talking about. That's right here. Normally this would be wired in like this. When I put the engine back in, I will normally plug it in right here and then jack it up. But when I'm taking it out, I want to make sure I disconnect it. You also want to have a look around. Make sure that everything is clear. Make sure we don't have anything left over. So we had a breather hose that hadn't quite popped off all the way. Now's the chance where you can look at that stuff before you get down too low. I also want to try and get my engine fairly balanced. Now it's pressing up against one of the oil lines, so it will tend to move around a little bit, but just want to find that kind of sweet spot and keep bringing it down. Got to disconnect these. So we still got to disconnect our idle control motor, throttle position sensor, and our airflow meter. But coming down nice and slow, could see that I'd forgotten those, and we just want to feed them out through the back here. Okay, I need you to go raise the car. There it is, out on the ground. All right, so I've got it sitting on my jack stands now, and this is the easiest and safest way to work on it. I'm going to pull the transmission off to get to the clutch and the rear main seal. I've still got the jack just sitting under there, but all the weight is sitting on my jack stands, and I've leveled the engine out. I'm also going to do my valve adjustment here while the engine is out. It's going to be a lot easier for me to access everything. I'll be able to tighten my rocker shafts, do all of that, and it'll be a lot easier than doing it in the car. So one of the first things I want to do is remove the wiring harness, the remnants of it from the engine. So I'm going to remove the alternator wire and the starter signal, as well as this is the backup light switch. Pull those back, and they're stuck. So this is a reusable zip tie. You don't want to just cut it. Okay, so that's my wiring off the transmission. This one is my speedometer, so it's going to come with the transmission, so just let it sit wherever. You can pull the starter motor off if you want, though I usually don't. I just undo the top bolt here. There's going to be 4 other bolts. I'm going to go and disconnect my throttle linkage. So just like the other ball socket, this one was really tight and was very rusty. And still doesn't want to release. The reason why this one is not coming off is this has a little locking pin on it. Not all of these ball sockets have them. I'd say most of them do not. So these have a pin that goes through and stops that ball socket from coming off. Ooh, that's not good. Need to replace that. Would have had a vacuum leak right there. I just noticed that this is all swollen up from oil. Might need to check and see if our diaphragm is leaking as well. If it's pulling fuel into it, it'll make it do that as well. Looks like this side is doing the same thing. I see how squishy it is and how loose it is. It's not sealing on that. That would create a rather large vacuum leak, which would make the car run too rich, as well as have no dampening, as well as have a vacuum leak at the same time as running rich, because when you release vacuum on the fuel pressure control, it bumps the fuel pressure to inject more fuel. So we'll take care of those at the same time. All right, so I'm gonna crack my starter loose. So I want to leave that one to last, and I'm going to undo the other 3 or 2, clean all the junk off. Take a look in here. Oh yeah. Yeah, so what we thought was rear main seal is more front transmission input shaft seal. That's pretty nasty in there. So a couple of things that we're looking at here. One, we can see this is Swepco gear oil sitting in the release bearing. So we've been losing oil out the front of the transmission. That's been running down. 2, here's our 2 sensors. Now there's 2 bolts right here. These have a set adjustment. The distance that this sensor is placed off the flywheel affects the signal quality. So the base setting is usually around 0.8 of a millimeter. You have to use a brass feeler gauge to set it, and this one's actually loose, which means that it's been moving around. And that is not a good thing, because that's going to change the signal and it's going to make it run erratically. So it looks like we'll be able to take care of some other issues here as well. This one in the back is the TDC sensor. And what it's looking for, if I can see on my flywheel somewhere, there should be a single mark. Oh, it's right down here at the bottom. I can feel it. You'll see it when I take the flywheel off. that single pointer is like a single tooth. As it comes around, it makes a spike on our sensor. And that's how the engine knows where TDC is. This sensor right here is our speed sensor, the one that's loose right now. This one is counting these teeth on our flywheel, and that's how the computer knows how fast the engine is turning. Okay, here's our clutch, and it's looking pretty worn out.
I told you that.
We can see how close these rivets are to where all of the material is pretty much gone, and the head of the rivet is about to hit. On this side, this is what happens when gear oil leaks. It's actually, you see how I had to pry it off? That's because the clutch was actually stuck, and gear oil makes this lining get really gooey. You can see on this side how it's nice and shiny, on this side how it's black. It's actually sticky to the touch, and this is from the gear oil that's been leaking in here. And it looks like our flywheel is about average. No real major cracking or heavy grooving. The rivets have not hit the flywheel yet. Should clean up nicely. We got some hot spots right here. Should clean up nicely with a grind. So we can see where the gear oils got in and turned the clutch dust to like goo. Careful when you're popping off the flywheel that you don't damage your speed sensors. There's our rear main seal that is actually clean and dry. Not leaking at all. So all of our oil leak coming down here looks like it was coming from our transmission. We're going to go ahead and change this anyways because we're in this deep. No point to leave it, but it looks like our transmission was our primary leak source. So we can see all this oil here that's in the bottom. We've seen it all over the clutch. A couple of things that I'm looking at since I'm going to have to order some parts in the morning is I want to see what my release fork feels like, if it's got any heavy wear, and it's fairly substantial, so we're going to need a fork. It's worn into that release bearing right there. It's got a decent sized groove in it, and our gasket or our little rubber seal ring up here is rock hard. Moves up and down nice and free, doesn't feel like there's any side to side because there are bronze bushings in both here and here that can be changed if needed. That doesn't feel bad, but definitely our gasket up there is rock hard, which is what happened. So we're going to need a replacement clutch fork for that wear. New set of gaskets. Originally I was thinking when I looked at it I was going to replace the guide sleeve, but it's worn through the plating, but it hasn't grooved up yet, so we could actually just continue to use that. These are usually about $115, $120, and we need to pull it out because behind here is an O-ring and the actual oil seal that is creating all of this oil leak. All right, so I've washed down all of our bell housing area, scrubbed it all out, got all the oil and grit out, and so what I'm going to do before I put this engine up on my engine stand is I'm going to replace the rear main seal. Right here is a little cutout in the case. This is for our screwdriver, and we want to be careful when we do this. that we don't drive our screwdriver in so deep that it damages crank in any way. And then I'm just going to pull that seal out, let the oil run out. I'll hose it out with some more brake clean. But that's our rear main seal out. Okay, so this is our rear main seal installer. You can do it without this tool, but this tool just makes it so much nicer. So I pulled the pilot bearing off the back of my crank, and this is the first arbor. And then what I'm going to do is grab my new seal, lube it up, sit it on here, put the installer on, and wind it in. So I'm just lubricating our seal with some silicone grease. All right, so I'm going to slide this onto our arbor and then just line it up like that. Then with our installer, screw that in. The advantages of using an installer is you have a lot more control. It also brings it in nice and straight and square. Just want to make sure when I bring this seal in that it's flush with the engine case. I don't want to take it past. And that's it. That's our rear main seal installed. Okay, so we've washed out this bell housing to get rid of all of the gear oil. And we're going to replace our clutch fork because of the wear pattern right here. You can see how this is worn flat. That is actually supposed to follow that. So we're going to replace the clutch fork. To do that, I'm going to drive this roll pin out. Like that. There's my roll pin. Pull my shaft. You can see our top gasket is pretty well grenaded. And here's my clutch shaft that I want to now wash up and clean up. I'm just hosing out this area. So the next thing I'm going to do is pull my guide sleeve out. This is where my input shaft seal and my O-ring are located that we need to change. So I'm going to use an impact driver to undo our screws because these are a tapered screw and they're usually in there really, really tight. So here's our two screws. Then this guide sleeve, if I turn it, I can usually pop it out. So here's our oil seal. Doesn't look super horrible. And our O-ring right here. O-ring definitely has been leaking. So I've got my flywheel just nipped down. You can also see that it's come back from the surface grinder. And looks a lot better than when we pulled everything apart. And that's pretty much a must. Every time you're going to do a clutch, you always want to make sure that you resurface the flywheel. A lot of the times we can do them on our lathe, but if they've got a lot of hot spots where they've been burnt, then you're always going to be better off taking it to a surface grinder and having them do it. It's going to give a better finish in the long run. So I'm tightening these to 90 Newton meters in a crisscross pattern. Here's a quick shot of the toolbox manual of how you check your setups on your speed sensor, and we're going to do that in just a few minutes. Okay, so I had to pull this bolt out and clean it a little bit. It wasn't tightening up, And what we're going to be doing, this is our engine speed sensor. It counts the teeth on the flywheel. This clearance right here is supposed to be 0.8 plus or minus 0.05. This is where we use our brass feeler gauges as well, because this is magnetic, and if I use a steel feeler gauge, it's going to change the way that I feel it. So I'm set to 0.8 right now. Slides between there, and it's pretty loose. Now, the bigger this clearance, the smaller the electrical waveform will be. So to adjust it, we have these two 6mm bolts. I'm just going to loosen them. And it will pivot like this on those bolts. So I've just loosened it up. I'm going to take my brass feeler gauge, slide it in, and hold a very slight pressure up against the sensor and the flywheel, and tighten my two 6mm bolts. And you should feel that light drag, which I do right now. Now on the front of the sensor, there's like a little point that it comes to. You're not going to feel the whole thing, so when you slide in there, you'll feel it pretty comfortably. Once you've set this one correctly, it automatically sets the reference mark, which is the second sensor. This is your top dead center sensor automatically. I want to also show you what this sensor is looking at on the flywheel. So this little dowel pin right here is the top dead center reference mark sensor. As it comes around, and it's only got one of these on the flywheel, this is what this second sensor is picking up. That's why the engine's got to make 2 engine revolutions before it will start, is because the first one, it's looking for that, then it times it to the second one, and it counts how many teeth of these teeth it sees between this signal coming past the first time and then coming past the second time. That way it can determine where the engine is, how much fuel to give it, and how much spark advance to give the engine. Okay, so I've got my new Sachs clutch kit here, and it comes with friction disc, release bearing, and pressure plate. Before I do anything, I need to assemble my release bearing onto my diaphragm. So when I do that, I'm going to take one shim, place it underneath, up against the release bearing, then my concave washer. That concave washer needs to face the diaphragm spring. Sit the release bearing underneath the pressure plate, and what I'm going to be doing is pushing it down. Then our locking ring is going to go with this surface without the groove facing the fingers. And then I'm going to press it down and put in this snap ring, which is going to hold it in place. Just like that. Our release bearing is assembled into our pressure plate. Very important, don't forget your ring gear. Have seen it happen several times. Nothing worse than finishing your clutch job, thinking how great you did, reaching in, hitting that key, and listening to the starter motor go bzzing. Not a good feeling. So I'm going to set my ring gear on. I've just lined up all of my bolt holes. It's got little cutouts here that allow for these little points to stick through on that ring gear. So now we're ready to get this and this onto the engine. So I have already greased my pilot bearing. This is a new pilot bearing, and I packed it with a little bit of wheel bearing grease. Less is better with this application. If you have too much, it's going to just fly off and contaminate the clutch. I'm using an alignment tool that's splined to the clutch. This is going to allow me to make sure everything lines up so the transmission will go on. Then I'm just going to take my pressure plate and slide it in. My bolts, so I'll line it up. Usually what I'll do when I'm first putting it on, I want to make sure that I've lined up because there's sets of 3s on one, I'll just make sure that the bolts will start. That way I know I've got my pressure plate in on the right place. All right, when I'm tightening up my clutch, I want to bring it down evenly, and what I do is I just use the center bolts out of the group of 3 just to get the clutch down, and you'll see the diaphragm as I pull it down will start to move out towards the release bearing. If you just tighten one side down all the way, you run the risk of damaging this diaphragm spring. So you want to bring it down consistently. Okay, release bearing's nice and free, which is what I'm looking for. Once I've got those 3 bolts just nipped down, I'll come in and just run the outer bolts on those groups down and nip them, and I'll hit them with a torque wrench next. I can pull my clutch pilot out because I've got pressure up against that friction disc. It's not going to go anywhere. When it comes to torquing these down, these are torqued at 25 Newton meters. If I put my torque wrench out here and try and tighten it, you see how that flywheel wants to move? So an easier way of doing this without having to fight it and hold the flywheel in place is if I have my torque wrench at an angle across, the engine itself, compression will just hold it in place, and I don't have to worry about the flywheel turning. Okay, so that's all 9 bolts, nicely torqued. You'll notice I didn't have to do a crisscross pattern or anything. That's because I pulled down the clutch with the center bolts first, and all I'm doing now is just making sure everything is correctly tightened. All right, so I want to lubricate my release bearing right here where it runs against the guide sleeve. Once again, do not want to load this up with a pound of grease. Just a small wipe. There's a little groove in there that I want to fill up. If I put too much in here, it's just going to fly off and contaminate the clutch. So that's it. That's all I need there. Okay, so I've got my transmission. We've put our new release fork on. Nice radius pieces instead of the worn out piece that we had before. Installed a new input shaft seal and O-ring. New bolts. These bolts come with Loctite factory installed, so I always replace them, and everything's tightened down. So before I install, I want to lightly lubricate the splines. This is where it's going to go into the clutch. A little bit for the pilot bearing area, and also just a small amount on our guide sleeve. Then the last place I want to lubricate is I'm going to put some grease directly on those contact patches. I don't need to lubricate the release bearing in that groove, just the forks. So I've got it sitting on my jack. Everything should be cleaned up, ready to go. I'm just going to line my release fork up. As I bring it in, I need to be able to twist that fork to line up with the groove right here on our release bearing. So what I'm doing is I'm looking in through this little window right here so I can see, and I'm just lining it up with that release bearing. So I had to put the transmission in gear and just rotate my axles to line up the splines. Didn't want to go in. You never want to put a nut and try and pull the transmission in. You should be able to get it pretty close to seated all the way before you put any of the retaining nuts on. When we pulled the transmission off the first time, we left the starter motor on. Ended up taking it off because I cleaned up this area. There was so much oil from the front seal leaking so much. So now I'm just going to slide the starter back in. Okay, I'm just going to hook my alternator power on and leave the nut on loosely because we still need the main battery cable from the vehicle. And then our terminal 50, which is our start impulse. Okay, I'm going to connect my backup light switch. Doesn't matter which terminals these wires go into. And then just pull the boot over it. And I've got my speedometer running through our reusable zip tie. That's all ready to go back in. I'm just going to add one zip tie around here to hold this harness in place. And then we're pretty much set back here to put this all back into the vehicle.
Would you like the door open or not?
All right, so I've just let the body down onto the engine. I got it sitting there. I'm just gonna let it pivot up and kind of slide back and snake around those drive shafts. So what I want to do is get my transmission into the body first. Then I can bring the rest of the engine up. So I want to make sure these pipes, our hot air pipe, doesn't get crushed up here between the starter. That's a common problem. So I always just want to kind of reach around and push it down over here. Same with my pipes, just keep them up and out of my way. Once I'm almost all the way up, I'm going to plug in my electrical fitting at the back of the motor right here and bring my other wiring through for my air mass meter and my throttle position sensors and idle control motors. Okay, so before I come all the way up, I'm going to start getting my bolts down and in, but I have to get my washer on the underside. So if I'm hard up against, that's not going to happen. So typically what I'll do is once I get close, I'll slide that washer in through the bolt. All right, so I've got my engine up, I've got my engine mount bolts just screwed down. I have not tightened yet. These are going to torque at 100 Newton meters, but I'm ready to lift the car up, and usually I start working underneath. Okay, I'm going to torque to 100 Newton meters. Okay, that's our engine and transmission bolts torqued, and the engine is basically back up into the car. I've just got to hook everything up to it now. Back here I'm going to push my speedometer wire back through the hole in the body and then stretch the rubber boot over the body. You want to make sure this is sealed up. And then I'm also, while I'm here, just pulling my rubber boot over the front of my transmission. I'll push it in from inside the car. I just want it started on the transmission like that. Okay, so I'm just skirting the engine, and that means making sure that my seal is properly installed around the engine tin. This is one of the most neglected jobs on a 911 engine install. If it's not properly skirted, you run the risk of engine overheating because hot air can flow directly off our cat and off our muffler and be drawn into the engine. So it's one of the most important jobs about doing this. Hooking up my battery line. Okay, so I've got most of my engine in and hooked back up, but before I hook up my wiring harness back here to the intake manifold, this is a common problem that can create all kinds of issues, from rough idles to injectors sticking open and hydraulically locking the motor with fuel, is this ground connection here becomes corroded. So we have all of these ground wires coming in at this one point. I'm going to use my little air-powered gasket cleaner with a pad. Once I've done one side, I'm going to flip them all over and do the other. Okay, once I've done my wiring harness, I've got it cleaned on both sides. I'm going to come in and clean my intake manifold. You can see there's a little bit of corrosion on the bottom there. You want to get these spotless before you screw this back together. So I've got my clutch cable in and adjusted, and this is my clutch actuation arm, and I haven't touched the adjuster yet. You can see the difference between what a new clutch and an old clutch looks like. This clearance in here is supposed to be 1 millimeter, and we have probably close to 4 or 5 millimeters of clearance there. So once you install your new clutch, you have to adjust that preload. I have my feeler gauges. I've got 2 stacked together to equal 1 millimeter. And I'm just going to wind in my clutch adjustment. Crack the lock nut off. And wind this in and adjust it so it has a 1 millimeter clearance. Okay, my 1 millimeter gauge slides in and out nice, and now we've got our clutch set back up for the new disc. So the last thing that I'm going to do before I start my engine is reconnect my battery. I already have oil in the engine. I've got 10 liters of oil in there, which is a good starting point. It'll probably take another 2 once the front cooler opens up. I've got everything hooked up, everything is tight. This is the last part of the job. Okay, we're ready to start up. Super light. You feel me?
Yes.
All right, so the last thing I have to do is just road test, make sure that everything works correctly. Clutch, I can feel the free play, that's our 1 millimeter. Nice and smooth all the way to the floor. And we're just going to take it for a quick spin around the block.